Hi, I'm Chris. This is Finding God at Work. Just a reminder that Finding God at Work isn't just a podcast, it's also an online course. Check it out at findinggodatwork.org. Our current series is Wholehearted, Becoming Healthier Christians at Work. And with this episode, we are bringing the series to a close. Way back in our first episode, we were looking at the question, how do we have both self-acceptance and a radical commitment to growth and change over time? Because intuitively, we know that we need both of those things. If we have some vision of human nature or human life that we're aspiring to, but our way of getting there is self-condemning or shame-based or constantly filled with guilt, we know that's going to put us in a dark place. That ultimately doesn't work. We need a way to accept ourselves and our real limitations, our real weaknesses, our real personalities in order to move forward. But we also know that moving forward is part of human experience, that we also need a radical commitment to growth and change over time. That if our vision of self-acceptance is just sort of pampering ourselves without ever being willing to confront problems in our behavior, problems in our character, our deep emotional needs and our need for life in an existential way, we're not going to end up where we need to be either. Somehow, paradoxically, we need both self-acceptance and a radical commitment to growth and change. And the good news is that Jesus, in his teaching on human nature, gives us that combination. He gives us exactly what we need to both be accepted, to accept ourselves, and to enter into a lifelong process of change, becoming the kind of human beings that we most deeply want to be, and in the Christian worldview, that we were created to be. So we looked at a variety of ways that Jesus put this together, his implicit holism in Luke chapter 10, where he affirms that we can love the Lord our God with our heart and our soul and our mind and our strength. When we kind of unpacked that as thoughts and feelings, our heart or will, our body, and our soul as relator, integrator, and receiver, that all of these things are meant to go together and be deployed for love in God's kingdom. So that was kind of our starting place for this series. We visualized it as one side of a Venn diagram, and then on the other side of the Venn diagram, we can look at all the mental health challenges we face in the workplace. So we looked at depression and anxiety, addiction and recovery, neurodiversity, and trauma. So we've been letting Jesus be our psychologist, letting his teaching guide our thinking and our feeling as we look at these different challenges, while also integrating valid insights from the social sciences and other sciences that can help us think about what it means to be healthy human beings. Now, there is a danger here for those of us who are disciples of Jesus. We looked at this a little bit in our first episode too, and that's the danger of us pursuing an unhealthy vision of life in a specifically quote-unquote Christian way, where you can have an unhealthy version of life that has religious overtones. And I would say usually this happens because people are pulling apart things that God wants to put together. So for example, you could have brain on a stick Christianity, where it's all about ideas, it's all about what you think. The feeling life is mocked or repressed or at least dismissed as not very relevant to Christian maturity. And when you're given that vision of Christianity and you try to live it out, it turns out you do have feelings and those matter. And so you can't actually live life as a brain on a stick because you're not a brain on a stick. You're an embodied, emotive human being. On the flip side, you can have other expressions of Christianity where we're just blobs of sensitivities who are never able to confront the difficulties of our life and take responsibility, that we have a will, we have a capacity to choose and to do something and to pursue what matters in life. So we can go off the rails in a lot of different ways, but what Jesus calls us to is to have these things together, our thoughts and our feelings, our will and our body, our soul, and that is the framework, the grounding from which we can look at these different mental health challenges that we face in a healthy way. And I think as we've dug into those various mental health challenges, we've seen an answer to our question. So our question, how do we both have self-acceptance and a radical commitment to growth and change over time as we face into all of the different challenges that we may have in our mental health, in the workplace, and beyond? And the answer we've seen is that we let God meet us with his gracious love in all our inadequacies, because his love takes us in as we are, and his love heals us. So just by way of review, we've seen that same theme interwoven through each of these different mental health challenges. So with depression, it's when we accept that we are experiencing depression, if we are, that we find that God's power is made perfect in our weakness. With anxiety, we learn that there's nothing God expects us to do that he will not empower us by his grace to accomplish. So again, we can accept our limitations, not have to be superheroes, but trust that God's grace will meet us and empower us to do the things that we do need to do. That future orientation can be one of peace as we see God providing for us. With addiction and recovery, we realize we have deep needs. We ultimately have a need for life. Addiction is a life source disorder. And the good news is there is a source of life offered us in Jesus. And so when we admit how we've sought life in unhealthy ways and then commit to radical change, we can actually receive life in healthy ways from Jesus and move forward in healing and in grace. With neurodiversity, we saw how every brain is different, that we're meant to be part of a motley crew, not every human being being the same, but different strengths, different abilities, different perspectives, and how when we accept that our brain is different and that that's okay, we end up being able to advocate for ourselves in the workplace, and that means we're actually advocating for others, and we're affirming the creativity and the diversity of God in the way that our work teams come together. And then finally, with trauma, we saw how when we identify our traumatic memories by tracing back from our challenges we're facing at work to our emotional responses to childhood or earlier experiences in our life that may be traumatic, that allows us to then welcome God's presence into those memories, allows us to unlearn our learned helplessness, allows us to move forward into new challenges in the workplace in a healthy way. We let God meet us with his gracious love in all our inadequacies. That love takes us in as we are, and that love heals us. So where do we go from here? Well, it's interesting. We've been talking a lot about human nature, right? Letting Jesus be our anthropologist. But we don't just need teachings or ideas about human nature. We need a vision of human life and love and work as it's meant to be. We need to see what human life can really be like. And thankfully, Jesus gives us that vision too. So in that same passage, Luke chapter 10, where Jesus affirmed this teaching of loving the Lord your God with all your heart and soul and mind and strength, and loving your neighbor as yourself, he actually went further and unpacked this teaching with a story so we could visualize what is this teaching really like? What is human life meant to be like? So this is starting in verse 29. The original person who had kind of been grilling Jesus, asking him some questions, that's the he here, but he wanted to justify himself, so he asked Jesus, "And who is my neighbor?" In reply, Jesus said, "A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho when he was attacked by robbers. They stripped him of his clothes, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. A priest happened to be going down the same road, and when he saw the man, he passed by on the other side. So too a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, as he traveled, came where the man was, and when he saw him, he took pity on him. He went to him and bandaged his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. Then he put the man on his own donkey, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. The next day he took out 2 denarii and gave them to the innkeeper. 'Look after him,' he said, 'and when I return, I will reimburse you for any extra expense you may have.'" Which of these 3 do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of robbers? The expert in the law replied, "The one who had mercy on him." Jesus told him, "Go and do likewise." Now, this famous parable of the Good Samaritan, as it's often called, is usually presented as a kind of summons to missional living, going out and serving the vulnerable. And we'll get there. You know me, I like mission. But I actually want to present a different lens for this passage from early Christian theologians in the first few centuries of the church. Sometimes this passage was viewed as an image of the incarnation, an image of Jesus becoming human, of God sending Jesus to meet us in our vulnerability. So first I want to start with just an idea of, some basic ideas about the incarnation, and then get back to this specific interpretation of this passage. So one of the earliest Christian theologians outside of the New Testament itself was a church father named Irenaeus. And Irenaeus wrote a book called Against Heresies, probably around 180 AD. And there's a little section in it where he's talking about Jesus's incarnation, how Jesus reveals the Father to humanity. And he says this: "For the glory of God is the living man, and the life of man is the vision of God." For the glory of God is the living man, and the life of man is the vision of God. Just a real important note here, when the word man is being used here, this is like a translation from the Latin, ultimately from the Greek anthropos, which really means human or humanity. And so it's not specifically talking about man versus woman, but human beings. So we could say, for the glory of God is the living human, and the life of humanity is the vision of God. What Irenaeus is saying here is that when we think about human nature, when we think about what human nature is meant to be, it's meant to be the glory of God. The glory of God is the living human. Without the presence and the glory of God, humanity can't be what it was meant to be. The life of humanity is the vision of God. In the same passage, Irenaeus writes that Jesus showed God to man and man to God. Jesus showed God to humanity and humanity to God. So Jesus, by being in his very nature God, but becoming human, shows us what human nature is meant to be. It's his life, his person, that is the vision of a human being fully alive, of humanity filled with the glory and life of God. That's what it means to be human. Okay, a couple centuries later, another theologian, Athanasius, writes a book called On the Incarnation. So this would have been in the early 300s. And in this book, he has this real pithy, beautiful statement summarizing the same idea that Irenaeus was talking about. So he's speaking about Jesus, and this is what he says: "For he was incarnate that we might be made God." For he was incarnate that we might be made God. Okay, now that could be misinterpreted. The kind of scriptural reference that Athanasius probably has in mind here is 2 Peter chapter 1, verse 4, where Peter says we can become participants in the divine nature. So this is not saying that we're going to become God in the sense that we're going to be equal with God or have the same powers of God or like create our own universes like God created his universe. That's not what it means. What it means is that the way that God is in his nature, his love, his character, his goodness, all the things that we've explored throughout this series in terms of the beauty of who God is as he comes to us with his gracious love, that we can become like that in our being. Because Jesus became like us, we can become like God. That's what it means. He became incarnate that we might be made God. The term for this that the Eastern Church has used is theosis, or deification, becoming like God. Again, sometimes the language can be confusing if you don't have the context here, but it's a beautiful image. It's our humanity becoming fully what it was meant to be because of God's grace. One of the kind of paraphrases of this idea from Irenaeus and from Athanasius is saying that we can become by grace what God is by nature. Humanity fully alive, the living human, the living man. Jesus shows us what humanity is meant to be. Okay, now with that in mind, just one generation later than Athanasius, you get Augustine, another key theologian, and he's looking at this passage of the parable of the Good Samaritan, right? And he's got all of these ideas about the incarnation of Jesus in his mind, and how Irenaeus taught about it, how Athanasius taught about it. Okay, so when he reads this passage and he gets to this story of this man who's attacked by robbers and stripped of his clothes and left for dead, what goes through Augustine's mind? He thinks this is about humanity as a whole. So I'm reading now from his commentary. He says, those who stripped him, namely of his immortality, and beat him by persuading him to sin, and left him half dead, because insofar as man can understand and know God, he lives, but insofar as he is wasted and oppressed by sin, he is dead. So what Augustine is saying is that this man on the road who's beat up, who's half dead, that's humanity. We're all beat up and half dead. We have so many flaws because of our sin, and we're so weak, and we can't help ourselves, and we just need somebody to come save us. So then, who does that make the Good Samaritan, who comes and bandages this man's wounds and pours on oil and wine and brings him to a safe place and takes care of him? It's Jesus. Jesus is the Good Samaritan. Jesus is the one who comes to us in all of our inadequacy and gives us God's gracious love, the love that takes us in just as we are, and the love that heals us. That's the vision for human life that we need. Okay, but we do get to mission, because how does Jesus end this teaching? He says, who was a neighbor to the man? And the expert in the law dutifully replies, the one who had mercy on him. And Jesus told him, go and do likewise. Because remember, we start from a place of self-acceptance in God's love, but then God's love moves us into a life of change and growth, and that's a life of mission. That's a life of us going out like Jesus went out to save us, to love and heal others in his name. We go and we see people who are lying on the side of the road, and we remember that, yes, they are part of broken humanity, laden with sin, full of inadequacies, just like us. And Jesus comes to them in us to save them, to help them find the same healing that we've found in Jesus. Jesus is not just our anthropologist. Jesus is the true Anthropos, the human that we were meant to be. And when we come into him through his gracious love, when we experience life with him, he turns us into the kind of human beings that we were meant to be. So as you move forward into the rest of your life at work, and you face these challenges, whether it's depression or anxiety, addiction, difficulties because of neurodiversity and the way people respond to that, trauma, other things that we didn't even have time to dig into specifically in this series, as you face those challenges in the workplace, as you run into your own inadequacies again and again, as all of us will in the workplace, remember this, that God can meet you with his gracious love in all of your inadequacies, because it's the love of Jesus that takes us in just as we are. It's the love of Jesus that heals us. It's the love of Jesus that makes us the kind of human being that we really want to be at work and everywhere else. Lord Jesus, thank you that you are the true Anthropos, the true human, the true worker, that you know how to be a whole and healthy human being at work. We ask that you would graciously love us, that we would experience that love so that we can work like you do, so that we can become healthier Christians at work. Do your work in us as we do our work with you. Amen.
Thanks for listening. Finding God at Work is a production of Mission Central, a ministry based in Aurora, Illinois, dedicated to forming Christians for mission in everyday life. You can subscribe to the podcast wherever you listen to this episode to get 10 minutes of teaching on faith and work every Tuesday and Thursday. To get resources to go deeper with each podcast series, read our blog, and get info about upcoming courses on faith in the workplace, go to our website, missioncentral.church.